And I think Gautam is on the line. He has to run in a little bit, so we're going to ask him to jump on. And then Bale, we'll hear from you in the last part of this. Gautam, are you around?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Would you like to share your screen?
I will very briefly. I just have one small thing to share, so I'll just leave it on the side. So folks, apologize. Let me do that first because this Microsoft Teams terrifies me. Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I am convinced I'm going to show you either my WhatsApp or my email, and I apologize for both in advance. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Have some snacks.
Yeah.
Sweet treats. These almond things are like amazing. Okay.
Are you able to see anything?
It's almost there.
Can you see that little text in the corner?
We did have a black. Oh, we can see, yes, the text is terrifying. So let's do sorry. It's a black screen at the moment. If you want, you can send us the image, even on WhatsApp, and then I'll just share it for you if you want.
Let me do that. Actually, I will just send it to you as an image, and I can just talk you through it. That's probably
that's great.
the easy thing to do. All right, sorry, folks. Just give me 1 second. And if it doesn't work, I will just pick this up. All right. I sent it to you, Jana. Okay. So let me just start off. So, folks, first, just apologies for coming in late and having to run off late. We're in a very southern predicament. India holds the presidency of the G20, and in the G20 year, we basically have seen a spate of new evictions in Delhi. And so there is an emergency meeting of the Delhi Housing Rights Task Force in 45 minutes about some kind of campaign response, because we're really sort of finding our backs to the wall around this kind of. I mean, it's so interesting to reflect on a southern moment on this, right? Because effectively it is India that, very conscious of its geopolitical image in a G20 forum, has decided that in a sense to clean up the city before the major meeting in September. So it's sort of an old school mega event, demolition displacement story that reminds you again that the power hierarchies of southern positioning vis-a-vis northern power, or at least a desire to be global in a particular way like the G20, sort of still structures so much of our relational positioning around the world, and that there would be this need to perform this kind of a certain version of urban development because the G20 is coming. I think it's quite striking, and the elements of that are so familiar in terms of a kind of developmental narrative: a riverside that's free of informal occupation, a certain pedestaling of urban environments, a cleaning up or a beautification of the form. So many things, but I wasn't actually going to talk about that. What I was going to talk about a bit was Jono and Catalina asked me to reflect a bit on sort of southern thinking in my own practice these days. So I'll take 5-7 minutes and just give you 2 examples of what's going on. So the main place where I find myself now vis-a-vis southern thinking is actually very specific, and it's that the first point in the corner of that image you can see, which is the idea of operational knowledge. What I mean by that is the last piece that I wrote about southern thinking was called Notes on a Southern Urban Practice, and I think that's a piece that this group also read. And I was really at that point thinking about more and more that, to me, that a lot of the job of the ethic of what drove many of us to southern thinking was this idea of speaking from place, of being deeply rooted in a set of particularities, to understand it intimately and to understand it with language and analytical categories that felt like they belonged to that place, no matter where they came from, to not assume a priori that a set of concepts, particularly canonical concepts, would do that work for us. This is now, I think, a familiar story. And when I did my PhD and when I did some of the earlier writing on thinking from the South, I think I felt quite, there's another word for it, sassy. I wanted to pick a fight. I just kind of like, I had a lot to say to a lot of people about how words were wrong. And I think at that point, that hit felt very necessary. In the mid 2000s, when I went to graduate school, there really was very little vocabulary that really talked about the South in a way that was empirically just to it and complex and nuanced. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think this is a wonderful thing. I don't think we have that kind of gap in empirical knowledge from the South. I think the last 10 years has seen an astonishing amount of writing that takes Southern empirics seriously, that describes more cities. The work is still not done. There's still a lot to do. And that does that with the kind of freshness that the categories are not predetermined. So I'm really happy to see that kind of movement. And I think it's been really powerful to kind of experience it. And I think, in a way, honestly, it sort of set me free from having to make that case. And it turned my own theoretical attention towards this question of saying, well, if you analyze something differently, then shouldn't the way you practice after that change? And that's really been, for me, the last 6-7 years, that's really been my theoretical and practical focus as a practitioner, as a researcher, as a teacher, which is to link the analytical with the operational, to say that analytical redescriptions must offer us new ways of moving. And so I've actually spent not that much time writing academically. Most of my work in the last 3-4 years is not in journals. I haven't written a piece after that Southern Urban Practice piece because honestly, also during COVID, I just couldn't bring myself to write in academic journals. I had sort of a good existential moment about the point of it all and decided there wasn't any, so I just stopped. And I don't recommend this. Don't quote me. It's I've paid my dues and got my job, and so I'm in a place where I can take more risk than some of you on this call. So before you go out and do that, just say there's moments in your life where battles are more pickable than others. I'm in a good moment to pick some battles, so I picked them. But we did a lot of work around COVID in particular, and all of that work was actually about this idea of the operational. So I want to say something about that very briefly. What I want to say is, I think that the operational gets a short shrift in academic scholarship. It's used very dismissively, the applied, the implementation, the practice of. It's almost like doing is somehow very distinct from thinking, and which is in turn distinct from feeling or being motivated morally and ethically towards a kind of direction. And I really, to me, practice is one of the most complicated intellectual spaces, because you need to be able to think about what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing. We almost speak of practice sometimes mechanistically, like it's almost like it's about administrating or operating something. The word operate is sort of intellectually seen as lesser. And I think that actually a lot of New Southern thinking is precisely the kind that has the chance to say the doing of things in contexts that are, have been lesser understood requires its own scholarship. And so I'm interested in what this scholarship, this looks like when it comes from practice and on practice. And I'm interested then in this mode of thinking, because unlike a lot of analytical scholarship, you can't think about practice without practicing. So you have to leave, in a way, the sites of analytical inquiry, and you have to put yourself in the messiness of doing things, not as an observer, not as an ethnographer, not as a critical reader, not as a documenter, but actually as a practitioner. Because one of the things about operational knowledge is if you have no stakes in the game, then it's hard to fully understand the implications of practice. I am very fond and very appreciative of critique. I'm also very aware of the seduction of the pleasure of the endless critique. And I've been trying to push against it just for myself. I mean, this is really, I'm not here to sort of suggest a good or better way of being in the world. I'm just telling you what's making me happy right now, morally and ethically, is just to get my hands dirty in the doing of things and using Southern knowledge as a way to understand why doing some things is so hard in my own city, and why particular ways of moving run into economic, institutional, and political frictions that seem very particular to our cities. So in short, the reason why certain modes of practice are easier or harder in Indian cities is because of the history of their urbanism. It's because of the structure of their urbanism, their institutional and social and spatial histories, right? There is a reason why mega events can lead to evictions in Delhi in a way that it cannot in London, right? I'm not saying that mega events do not displace in London or produce inequity in London, but they do so in very different ways than they do in Delhi, right? And I think for me, those kinds of practices are a very fertile way of imagining. So there's two things that I've been getting involved in. The first one is an extended policy practice, state advisory, movement advocacy role around the idea of an urban employment guarantee. And there's a bunch to study on it. So India has for a long time had one of the world's largest public works programs. It's called the National Rural Employment Guarantee. So all adults in all households in rural India get 100 days of guaranteed work by the state per year. Right? So it's a social safety net, it's an employment guarantee, it's a very interesting policy modality. But for us, it's been very important. It's always only been rural. Right? And this strikes at the heart of a lot of the way social protection is understood in India, which is that it is rurally imagined. And this is true of many contexts of the South. Right? Where the urban is the place where you produce, where capital sits, where GDP comes, where you make your money, and the rural is where you do welfare, you do protection, where the soul of the nation lives. Right? So in many ways, there's been this distinction between the urban and the rural as sites for social protection. So over the last 4 years, as part of a group called the People's Action for Employment Guarantee, with many, many other folks, we have been trying to lobby for the extension of the rural employment guarantee to urban areas. And the question here is intellectually fascinating. It's not just a question of suddenly moving it, right, and creating the law. You can do that. But the intellectual question is different. The intellectual question is, what is an employment guarantee in an informal urban labor market? Because it's very different from the way it works in a rural market. The rural employment guarantee was structured for 100 days in order to fill the gap between harvesting and agricultural cycles to counter seasonal migration. The urban in India does not lack jobs. We don't have an unemployment problem. We have an increasing unemployment problem, but our dominant problem is a quality of employment problem, right? And the quality of employment problem is that the decency of our work and the adequacy of informal work is very low. So in an urban area, the other question was the question that came from a lot of my own earlier work, which is, who is this person who's going to take this benefit in urban areas? In the rural area, the beneficiary was self-evident. The question of who a rural resident is not a question. The question of who an urban resident is an absolute foundational Southern question, socially, economically, legally, because you are not meant to belong to urban areas in many parts of the South. Right? And in many cases, belonging to the urban area requires an ability to enter its housing markets legally. Now, this is where everything we've said about economic informality and Southern urbanism comes home. If I come to the city as a migrant and I have to enter into the housing market informally without any rental agreement or any paperwork, I never on paper become an urban resident and never become legible to the state. Right? So the urban actually has a foundational problem where even if you create a new employment guarantee, the ability of someone to say, I'm an urban resident, take me, I'll apply for this, has to be constructed. And so the distinction conceptually between being present in an urban area, between being resident in an urban area, and being a citizen while being both in an urban area become confounding operational questions as well as conceptual questions of who has the right to the city or who belongs. But solving the question of resident has a very different tack if you're solving it actually operationally, if you want to solve it in a way that's legitimate to a bureaucratic officer. So what did we argue conceptually? And I'll take this and I'll close. So we argued conceptually for many years that within the southern urban, residence should not be the conceptual marker. It should be the idea of the intent to reside. Okay? Now, that's an interesting story. The intent to reside is not asking a migrant or someone who comes to the city to say, come here, take a place to rent or live, get an identification, get a local address, get some piece of paper that has a name and an address on it so you can be an urban resident. It doesn't say, how many years have you managed to live here? How many ID proofs have you accumulated? How much weight and evidence of residence have you put in? It asks you instead, what is your intention? If your intention is to stay in the city, then that should be enough to include you in social protection. Now, this is exactly the kind of analytical move which in Southern urban theory I would love, right? Theory from the South. You need an idea of intent to reside in cities of the South because it is in those cities where the question of residence is not self-evident, but has to be built by people. But the problem is, how do you tell a bureaucrat in the Ministry of Local Government administering a project to design a form that a migrant can actually fill to get an actual right in actual life that is based on the conceptual abstraction of the intent to reside? And that to turn. The operational turn is the challenge of taking a powerful analytical conceptual intervention and managing to give it an empirical, operational, institutional form that holds on to its conceptual power, but also becomes something that can actually be done. So we articulated by finding Supreme Court legal precedents, policy precedents, other mandates, because we knew this would be challenged, an articulation that became part of the definition of residence for a lot of laws. And it goes like this. If you are able to be in the city for 180 days and you evidence an intent to reside by getting any one of 37 different documents, which can include a letter from your neighbor, the enrollment of your child in a primary school, a visit to a community health worker, the attempt to write and or register in a local food ration supply board, right? Membership of a local association or religious body. So multiple ways to just put your mark somewhere on the city and show up on paper, that we would then take that as evidence of an intention to reside, that we would include early as opposed to making residence a test of long-term presence. And this articulation found its way into some of the new social protection work in the western state of Rajasthan in India, where I've been doing a lot of my work. So both in the Arctic, so the state of Rajasthan last year announced one of the largest urban employment guarantee programs, which was one big operational success led by the movements, people's movements in that state and that state government. In its definition, it articulated and used the question of the intent to reside as the concept with the definition of 180 days, which means it operationalized this conceptual intervention to say in our cities, residence must be enshrined in law and made easier because the urban condition will not make it possible. Right? And I say this only to show this loop between conceptual articulation that comes from an understanding of the particularity of our cities, but that the work and scholarship that you need to change a conceptual articulation into an operational articulation is specific. And for me, that is the kind of work that my brain and heart these days really wants to do. And that's kind of what I keep coming to. I get very, it's what sort of, for a long time, the discovery of a sort of clever analytical reframing really sort of, lit my fires and got me going. I still love that work, right? And I think that work is incredibly powerful and I love reading that work. But in this stage of my life, what Southern knowledge or Southern practice means to me is to do the work to move from the analytical to the operational. and to do it in a way that it is governments here that apply it. I'm not interested in it becoming a best practice case for something international or global. I'm interested in it being legible to governance and institutional and social structures in these cities where I live and work. And I think that move to the operational is a really powerful one. So I'll end here and say, yesterday, that policy of the urban employment program, that first big one in Rajasthan, what you're seeing on the left, which is called the Rajasthan Minimum Income Guarantee Bill. This is a bill that is tabled in the State Assembly last night, will hopefully pass this week by vote. It should, they have the numbers. And it will turn the idea of urban employment guarantee into a law as opposed to a policy. So it will become enshrined as a legally protected law. And this gives us an opportunity to really work with the government to build, I wrote so much about how there are patchworks of the safety nets in southern cities, right? I wrote in COVID how Indian social protections were broken and need for repair. And I talked about repair. I feel like this is what repair looks like operationally. I feel like this is a way to give teeth to that idea. And I want to say only that I want to be very clear about one thing. I'm not giving you this example to suggest that that concept of repair is meaningful because now it exists in the real world. This is not a theory versus practice dichotomy. I'm saying that without that theorizing, without that understanding, I would never have known the practice propositions that I'm fighting for now. So I think that the work that we should all be doing is to say, what is the operational to my analytical? And what is the analytical to my operational? So if you find yourself more practice oriented, reach back for the analytical foundations of your work. If you find yourself more analytically oriented, imagine the operational application of your work and offer it to readers. You don't have to do both. I never did both at one time. I did a lot more of this and I do a lot more of that. But I think finding and imagining different readers and audiences, I think is important. Otherwise, we get very defensive. The practitioners are really defensive that they're asked to articulate intellectually or they're always critiqued. And the theorists are very defensive that they're always asked to say, well, what do I do with this? I think these are both silly positions that don't move us forward. But then we have to do the work and say, here's my analysis, here's what it can offer to someone seeking to operate. And the practitioners can say, here's what I'm doing, and here's the analytical understanding from where it comes. I'm not doing this blindly. I think making these bridges between the analytical and the operational are powerful, and they are instinctively Southern because operations and practice require deep location. You cannot just move across context to practice. You have to know where you are. You have to earn your place. So that's been my relationship to a lot of thinking in general. I think the placedness of my work has moved from an analytical positioning to just where I live and work in life. And the practice contexts have defined that place for me. And it's felt incredibly grounding, I think, in many ways. And so I feel both grateful for that sort of early theoretical work, and I feel really intellectually challenged and inspired and mostly frustrated and largely fraught, but usually happy about the chance to just muck about in trying to give it some life and legs. So I'll stop there.
Well, Gata, thank you so much. That was really lovely.